Welcome to Tomorrow Access Safety Training. You are about to complete an e-learn training module for personal protective equipment. A quiz will be provided at the end of this training. Please notify your supervisor when you have completed the quiz. This training was prepared under a Consultation Education and Training grant awarded by MIOSHA. MIOSHA is part of the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs. Points of view or opinions stated in this document or training do not necessarily reflect the view or policies of LARA. The objectives of this e-learning training module will be to describe the hierarchy of controls as relates to personal protective equipment, to identify types of personal protective equipment utilized in general industry, to explain personal protective equipment training requirements, explain the responsibilities of the employer regarding personal protective equipment, and to explain the employee responsibilities regarding personal protective equipment. MIOSHA Standard Part 33, Personal Protective Equipment, requires employers to protect their employees from workplace hazards through the use of engineering or work practice controls. When these controls are not feasible or do not provide sufficient protection, the use of personal protective equipment or PPE is required. Remember, personal protective equipment is the last level of control. The hierarchy or levels of control methods is represented in this graph. This graph illustrates the effectiveness of the systems used to prevent and control hazards. Engineering controls are the second most effective means of protecting employees from hazards, followed by administrative and work controls. This means a physical change is made to the workplace or equipment to remove the hazard. Providing and using personal protective equipment or PPE is the last resort for removing a safety hazard because it is the least effective. Elimination or substitution, the top level. This level provides the highest level of protection against hazards. The hazard is eliminated from the workplace, or a safer item or substance is substituted for the more hazardous item or substance. Another type of substitution includes using the same chemical but to use it in a different form. For example, a dry dusty powder may be a significant inhalation hazard, but if this material can be purchased and used as a pellet or crystal, there may be less dust in the air and therefore less exposure. This is an example of eliminating or substituting an item to remove a safety hazard. The next hierarchy of control is by removing a safety hazard through engineering controls. Removing a safety hazard through engineering controls requires a physical change to be made to the workplace based on the following principles. If feasible, design the facility, equipment, or process to remove the hazard. If removal is not feasible, enclose the hazard to prevent exposure in normal operations. Where complete enclosure is not feasible, establish barriers or local ventilation to reduce exposure to the hazard in normal operations. For examples, you can isolate the hazard, or use ventilation, or use equipment modifications by reducing the hazard through design of the equipment or attachments. For example, reduce vibration, or using a dust collection system or noise reduction system, or placing a guard on a piece of equipment. The next hierarchy of control is removing a safety hazard by administrative controls. This includes administrative controls. The next hierarchy of control of removing a safety hazard is through administrative controls or changing work practices. This requires the worker or employer to do something different. For example, changing work procedures or proper procedures, workplace rules, or other operation-specific rules. Housekeeping, ensuring an area is cleaned up on a regular basis. Make sure there are regular inspections to equipment or work areas to make sure a workspace is kept clean and free of hazards. Monitoring the use of highly hazardous materials to make sure that there is not overuse. Make sure there is supervision to ensure safety of staff at all times. Making sure there is appropriate training so that staff is aware of how to safely use equipment and to minimize injury. Regulating areas to ensure that only staff that are trained properly are working in areas where there may be safety hazards. And the last hierarchy of control level is PPE. MIOSHA requires employers to protect their employees from workplace hazards through the use of engineering or work practice controls. When these controls are not feasible or do not provide sufficient protection, the use of personal protective equipment is required. Wearing a safety helmet or hard hat is one of the easiest ways to protect an employee's head from injury. Hard hats can protect employees from impact and penetration hazards as well as from electrical shock and burn hazards. Employers must ensure that their employees wear head protection if any of the following apply. Objects may fall from above and strike them on the head. They might bump their heads against fixed objects such as exposed pipes or beams. Or there is a possibility of accidental head contact with electrical hazards. Protecting employees from potential head injuries is a key element of any safety program. A head injury can impair an employee for life, or it can be fatal. Your head is a very delicate part of your body. In and around your head are your eyes, with which you see, your ears, your nose, your mouth, your brain. Injuries to your head can be very serious. For this reason, head protection and safety are very, very important. In addition to selecting protective headgear that meets ANSI standard requirements, employers should ensure that employees wear hard hats that provide appropriate protection against potential workplace hazards. It is important for employers to understand and protect all employees from potential hazards when making this selection, including electrical hazards. Employees can be exposed to a large number of hazards that can pose danger to their eyes and face. MIOSHA requires employers to ensure that employees have appropriate eye or face protection if they are exposed to eye or face hazards from flying particles, molten, metal, liquid chemicals, acids or caustic liquids, chemical gases or vapors, potentially infectious material, or potentially harmful light radiation. For example, this could include acids or other caustic liquid chemicals that might splash, such as toilet cleaners, blood or other potentially infectious materials that might splash or spray, intense light that can be created by welding and lasers, dust or other flying particles such as sawdust or metal shavings, or even molten metals that might splash. Eye and face personal protective equipment shall be distinctly marked to facilitate the identification of the manufacturer. The following minimum requirements must be met by all protective devices. and shall provide adequate protection against the particular hazards for which they are designed. Safety glasses are used to protect against moderate impacts from particles. And goggles are used to protect eyes and the facial area immediately surrounding the eyes from impact, dust, and splashes. Some goggles can be used under and over corrective lenses if they fit. Safety goggles are used as primary protection to shield the eyes from heat hazards. Goggles form a protective seal from around the eyes, preventing objects or liquids from entering under or around the goggles. This is especially important when working with or around molten metals that may splash. When employees are exposed to high temperatures, additional protection beyond that offered by primary protectors may be required. Use safety goggles in combination with a heat reflective face shield for severe temperature exposure. Consider specific lens, frame, and ventilation options when selecting safety goggles. Ventilated goggles allow air circulation while providing protection against airborne particles, dust, liquids, or light. Face shields are intended to protect the entire face or portions of it from impact hazards such as flying fragments, objects, large chips, and particles. When worn alone, face shields do not protect employees from impact hazards. Use face shields in combination with safety spectacles or goggles, even in the absence of dust or potential splashes, for additional protection beyond that offered by spectacles or goggles alone. Respiratory protection PPE. Respiratory protection is used to eliminate toxic material and usually when working in confined spaces. It is to be used only when engineering controls are not feasible. Before an employee is authorized to use a respirator as a PPE, they must go through a medical evaluation to determine the ability of the employee to use the respirator. Once an employee is authorized to use the respirator as PPE, they must be trained on the proper use of the respirator, how to inspect and clean the unit, and how to properly store it. Hearing protection. Noise or unwanted sound is one of the most common health problems in America. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health estimates that 30 million workers in the U.S. are exposed to hazardous noise. Exposure to high levels of noise may cause hearing loss, create physical and psychological stress, reduce productivity, interfere with communication, and contribute to accidents and injuries by making it difficult to hear warning sounds. MIOSHA requires employers to determine if workers are exposed to excessive noise in the workplace. If so, the employers must implement feasible engineering or administrative controls to eliminate or reduce hazardous levels of noise. Where controls are not sufficient, employers must implement an effective hearing conservation program. The employer must provide ear protection when the noise level in the work area is greater than indicated in this table. Hearing protection devices are considered the last option to control exposures to noise. Hearing protection devices are generally used during the necessary time it takes to implement engineering or administrative controls, or when such controls are not feasible. This slide shows some examples of hearing protection devices. This slide demonstrates how to insert earplugs properly. 1. Roll. 2. Pull. 3. Hold. The employer shall select and require employees the proper use of hand protection when exposed to hazards. Potential hazards for hands include skin absorption of hazardous substances, lacerations or severe cuts, punctures, chemical burns, thermal burns, or extreme temperatures. There are many types of gloves available today to protect against a wide variety of hazards. The nature of the hazard and the operation involved will affect the selection of gloves. The variety of potential occupational hand injuries makes selecting the right pair of gloves challenging. It is essential that employees use gloves specifically designed for the hazards and tasks found in their workplace, because gloves designed for one function may not protect against a different function, even though they may appear to be an appropriate protective device. Employees who face possible foot or leg injuries from falling or rolling objects or from crushing or penetrating objects should wear protective footwear. Also, employees whose work involves exposure to hot substances or corrosion or poisonous materials must have protective gear to cover exposed body parts, including legs and feet. Safety shoes have impact-resistant toes and heat-resistant soles that protect the feet against hot surfaces common in roofing, paving, and hot metal industries. The metal insoles of some safety shoes protect against puncture wounds. Safety shoes may also be designed to be electrically conductive to prevent the buildup of static electricity in areas with potential for explosive atmospheres, or non-conductive to protect workers from workplace electrical hazards. Body protection and protective clothing. Employees who face possible bodily injury of any kind that cannot be eliminated through engineering, work practice, or administrative controls must wear appropriate body protection while performing their jobs. In addition to cuts and radiation, the following are examples of workplace hazards that could cause bodily injury: temperature extremes, hot splashes, potential impacts from tools or machinery and materials, or hazardous chemicals. There are many varieties of protective clothing available for specific hazards. Employees are required to ensure that their employees wear protective equipment only for the part of the body exposed to possible injury. For example, a body protection include laboratory coats, coveralls, vests, jackets, aprons, surgical gowns, and full body suits. To ensure the greatest possible protection for employees in the workplace, the cooperative efforts of both employers and employees will help in establishing and maintaining a safe and healthy work environment. In general, to ensure the greatest possible protection for employees in the workplace, the cooperative efforts of both employers and employees will help in establishing and maintaining a safe and healthful work environment. In general, employers are responsible for performing a hazard assessment of the workplace to identify and control physical and health hazards. Identifying and providing appropriate personal protective equipment for employees, training employees in the use and care of the PPE, maintaining PPE, including replacing worn or damaged PPE, periodically reviewing, updating, and evaluating the effectiveness of the PPE program. The employer is also required to pay for PPE used to comply with MIOSHA standards. If you would like to receive additional information regarding personal protective equipment in the workplace, you can visit the MIOSHA website at www.michigan.gov MIOSHA publications where additional information may be available, or contact the Consultation Education and Training Division at 517-322-1809.